Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Matteo Colombo. He is an associate professor in the Tilburg Center for Logic, Ethics, and Philosophy of Science, and in the Department of Philosophy at Tilburg University. Much of his work is in the foundations of computational neuroscience, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and moral psychology. Is especially interested in the places where these areas overlap, and today we're going to cover some of the topics Dr. Colombo explores in his work. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo, for having me, and hi, everybody.
So let's start perhaps with a general question. So there's this area or sub area, let's say, of experimental philosophy. So what is it exactly, and to what questions does it apply?
So there are two broad strands of experimental philosophy, as far as I could tell. One strand is especially focused on something called the method of cases or thought experiments in philosophy. So suppose that I ask you to imagine a situation where you have a duplicate of Ricardo, that is a physical duplicate, and then I ask you to imagine whether that duplicate could lack conscious experience. Okay, this would be an example of a zombie duplicate of Ricardo, and if you share some philosophers' intuitions, then this kind of case should suggest that conscious experience cannot be reduced to physical properties. Okay, so this would be an example of a use of the method of cases to work out philosophical conclusions, in this case about the nature of consciousness. And within one strand of experimental philosophy, the question is this method of cases reliable? When is it reliable? And what kind of conclusions can we draw from it? So sometimes this program is called negative program in experimental philosophy. And one of the main claims made within this strand is that the method of cases is unreliable when it comes to providing evidence in support of philosophical conclusions. The second strand in experimental philosophy is slightly broader. So there is also a reliance on experimental methods, for instance, survey methods, but even other methods, typically, say, methods involved in social psychology, for example. So the research in this strand is more focused on, how humans function psychologically. And this kind of understanding, is fairly old in philosophy. If you think about, for instance, ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle, well, he also, made assumptions about human functioning and the psychology of humans. So questions within this strand concern for us the role of emotion in moral reasoning and moral behavior. Or for instance, something I worked on, the role of intellectual humility in, say, motivating behavior, that is pro-social behavior, and also its relation with prejudice towards out-group members. So these are just two broad strands in experimental philosophy. One more focused on intuitions and the method of cases. The second one more focused on, human psychology and possible presuppositions in philosophy, for instance, moral philosophy, ethics, philosophy of language, about how certain concepts in human psychology would work.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned intellectual humility there. What is that?
So intellectual humility could be understood as a virtuous mean between arrogance and self-deprecation. So that's a sort of definition that can be understood in terms of I'm aware of my own limitations, of all the stuff I do not know. And the second dimension has more to do with to what extent I care about intellectual achievements because I care about social rewards that might come with them. So this type of characterization is again very much in line with a traditional understanding of humility as bringing down to earth. The etymology of humility has to do with humus, so a sort of abasement. And the way myself and collaborators try to unpack and understand this notion is more focused on social rewards and accurately owning your own limitations in terms of what you know and the kind of evidence you know in support of your own beliefs and judgments.
And is there a relationship between intellectual humility and prejudice?
Well, there might be. There are at least two views on this question. So I mentioned the pedigree of intellectual humility, the ancient pedigree, and within, for instance, religious traditions, I have in mind, for instance, early Christian fathers, monastic traditions from also the Middle East, say humility, and specifically intellectual humility, is thought to be an antidote to something like vanity, something like also pride and prejudice towards others. Okay, so if you ask, early, Christian, monks, they would say, of course, intellectual humility is a good, antidote against vices of pride, arrogance, and also prejudice. Well, other philosophers, for instance, David Hume, in an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, include humility in his list of monkish virtues. And these are not good when it comes to prejudice. Hume says that monkish virtues stupefy the understanding and harden the heart, obscure the fancy, and sour the temper. So according to this second view on the relationship between prejudice and intellectual humility, humility would actually make prejudice and oppression worse, because Hume tends to associate humility with abasement and self-deprecation. In work and collaborative work with, young researchers like Jasmina Kostadinova and others, we looked at experimentally the relationship between something called prejudice dissimilarity link and the role of intellectual humility on this link. So to put it very briefly, in our study, we found three things. So the first thing is that people tend to be prejudiced, that is, having negative attitudes towards groups which are perceived very different from their own. So for instance, if I associate Ricardo here with the Cristiano Ronaldo fans, and I find this group of individuals very dissimilar from the type of human being I happen to be, then likely I will feel negative emotions, I will have a negative attitude against Ricardo. And so that's one of the results of our experiment. The second, possibly more interesting result is that intellectual humility weakens this association between prejudice and dissimilarity. And so this suggests that intellectual humility has a positive epistemic effect on people and also moral effect. The third and possibly more strange result in this research is that overall, more intellectual humility is associated with more prejudice towards the similar people. Okay, so this is a bit paradoxical, and one way to understand why intellectual humility would make prejudice more severe is that highly intellectually humble people might also have accurate understanding of the limitations of others, and insofar as others, also harbor arrogance and are very confident in their beliefs and attitudes, then maybe the intellectually humble wants to distance themselves from these more dissimilar people.
Right. So, and do you know if there's any solution to what you just mentioned? I mean, prejudices people sometimes hold toward others that have a worldview dissimilar from their own.
So this is a very complicated question, especially in this part of the world, especially in this historical period where people have many opinions and tend to share their opinions with unknown
Right.
people. So in research with Jan Volkel and Mark Brandt, we wanted to test to what extent pinching something called an illusion of explanatory depth in the domain of politics would be a sort of remedy to this association between prejudice and dissimilarity. So, for instance, the illusion of explanatory depth is defined as the feeling of people that they understand more than they actually do. That is, they understand the world in far greater detail, coherence, and depth than what they actually do and understand. So suppose that I ask you, what's gonna be the effect of Portugal exiting the European Union? Okay, so you might have certain confidence in your prediction, and then I ask you, okay, then explain to me step by step the causal process leading from Portugal leaving European Union to the consequences you believe that will happen. Okay, and typically people lower their degree of confidence after they're asked, okay, explain me, step by step the process. What we found in this study, intervening on this illusion of explanatory depth in the domain of politics, is that people are insensitive to this, pinching of explanatory depth. That is, even if their confidence about, the effects of certain social policies get, sort of reduced, this reduction in confidence doesn't have any obvious effect with this prejudice dissimilarity link. And so this was a sort of failed replication of previous studies looking at the role of this illusion of explanatory depth in prejudice. Another potential way, of making this connection, this association less severe would be, to hang out with people who are very different from you, pursuing a common project. Okay? For instance, if I share the love for football with Ricardo and we hang out, to pursue our common interest, even if I find Ricardo very different from the way I am, maybe my prejudice just by doing stuff with him will go down in terms of prejudice and negative feelings.
Right. So, changing topics, I would like to ask you about large-scale brain simulation. So, because in recent years, particularly, people have been talking a lot about them and what would be their potential benefits, what we can gain from them scientifically. So, first of all, what are they, and do they seem to be a good investment or not?
So what are large-scale brain simulations? Here is a definition that would apply to many large-scale neural simulations. So in these simulations, you have a simulating system, typically a computing system, implementing some procedure, some algorithmic procedure that finds solutions to a set of equations, mathematical equations that represent a network of neurons. Okay, or a brain region including the dynamics of activity in this region, including a large number of neurons and their connections. So we can say over 1 million. Now, given this definition, the uses of large-scale simulations can be quite different. Some large-scale neurosimulations are focused on trying to understand how the brain works. For instance, when it comes to, supporting behavior in relation to others, for example. Other large-scale neural simulations are less focused on how the brain or the nervous system works and more interested in getting inspiration from the style of computing of the brain to develop, say, models that can perform tasks, for instance, recognizing images, or for instance, playing certain computer games at a superhuman level. And this kind of trend is more associated with the rise or the rediscovery of deep connectionist networks. Right? The third possible use of large-scale neurosimulations, on which I wrote a couple of papers, is to try to understand the computational properties of the computing system itself, not the target represented by the model implemented on the computer. And specifically, I was interested in understanding how very large-scale neurosimulations can be used to assess energy consumption of a computing system. So if you think about our brains, those are excellent in terms of energy consumption. How do you know? Well, if you just touch, for instance, my forehead, you will not get burned. If you touch a supercomputer, as it is processing information, probably you're going to get burned. And so that's just, quick evidence for the excellent energy, say, efficiency of the brain. And again, in this paper, I wanted to look at practices focused on this third usage of large-scale neural simulations.
But do they get or have they been getting the results that they are looking for or not?
Depends where you're looking at. For instance, the first trend that is trying to understand the brain and cognition by focusing on the details of neural networks has been a controversial project. What I have in mind is something called the Human Brain Project, which was headed by Henry Markram in the early 2000s. And the aim of this project was to simulate brains of mammals with a very high level of accuracy, down to the molecular level.
Yeah.
Other scholars, other neuroscientists thought that this kind of approach was misguided, in a way also a waste of resources, okay? Because, say, focusing on the very details of, for instance, molecular dynamics might not get you answers about how a biological substrate can produce, our mental life. And so not focusing on the tiny details would have been better, according to critics of this Human Brain Project. If you look instead at the rise of deep neural networks, now the field is moving at a very fast pace in very different domains, from large language models. Recently there's been the release of a new chatbot. You might have also heard of the drama happening at Google. One of the engineers believed that one of these chatbots was sentient. So for this kind of trend, I think that there's been a lot of progress from an engineering perspective. These tools are extremely helpful already for doing research as add-ons. but their payoff when it comes to understanding, human cognition is more contentious. And then again, the third strand I was mentioning about the use of large-scale brain simulations to understand, the computational efficiency or energy efficiency of certain materials. Also, there's been quite a lot of development. And again, if you think of the rate of processing and energy saving of computers, personal computers even, in the past couple of decades, there's been a lot of progress, and large-scale neural simulations can contribute a tiny bit of information about properties, computational properties, in virtue of which, there is high energy efficiency in computation.
Mm-hmm. So I think that this in a way connects very well to my next question, which has to do with another big debate in cognitive science and neuroscience that has to do with levels of explanation. So what are these levels of explanation, and what kinds of questions do people ask there when it comes to trying to understand if there's a best level to look at to understand what causes behavior or what explains the phenomena that we see happening in the brain, etc.
So let me give you one example. So something I also worked on is the question, why do people comply with social norms? So this question is focused on behavior, is focused on something social. Yeah. And it seems that the proper level for addressing this question is just the level of sociology, social psychology, and so that kind of level. Now, if you zoom in or zoom out, that is, depending on the scope of your zoom, you might, want to focus, for instance, on dopamine neurons, that is, dopaminergic activity in certain areas of your brain. Why? Because there is a reliable association between activity, dopaminergic activity in the brain, and, people's tendency to comply with social norms. If you go one step up, you can also focus on networks in the brain, on circuits. Okay, so not just dopaminergic neurons, but also dopaminergic neurons in the striatal area and prefrontal cortex. Why? Again, because there is reliable evidence that social norm compliance is associated with these circuits. And so it might make sense, to understand this phenomenon also by looking at this neural mechanism. Next, if you go again, you zoom out a bit, you can put in the picture other individuals, other agents, people, the material environment, which often, gives us cues as to whether or not comply with a social norm. And then again, if you zoom again out, you're going to have whole societies, groups sharing, normative expectations about, what's expected in a certain context. If I go, for instance, to the States, United States, probably will be expected to leave a tip after a meal at a restaurant. In the Netherlands, that expectation is not that obvious. Okay, and that's a difference in social norms, and this difference can also be studied and understood at a more group social level. Now, what I've been describing are all levels in a way, and each one of them contributes a perspective on a complex phenomenon like social norm compliance. Now, philosophers of science, for instance, Patham and Oppenheim, just to give you, one reference, have understood the relationship between levels in science as a pyramid. So, various layers. The fundamental layer is fundamental physics, and all the other layers can be reduced to to nothing but, fundamental physics. This view is increasingly implausible, okay, both in philosophy and also in the cognitive sciences. A more prominent and popular approach to understanding levels in the cognitive sciences is associated with work by David Marr. In Vision, it describes a three-level framework, for analyzing computing systems, like, for instance, a cache registry. One level, the computational level, concerns what a certain system is doing and why it is doing that kind of activity, or it's performing a certain task as opposed to another. Then there is this algorithmic level, which is a level of analysis where representations and algorithmic procedures are, say, studied as for solving the task posited at the computational level. And then there is the level of implementation, that is the level of the physical substrate on which these algorithmic procedures and representations would be implemented. Okay, so these are just two models, one more reductionist model and one model more focused on levels of analysis in computational neuroscience, that have been quite prominent, and especially the second approach has been quite helpful for many researchers to try to clarify their goals in modeling behavior or brain activity by using a certain language, a certain modeling tools.
But I mean, what is the best way of thinking about how we should apply these different levels of explanation? Because, I mean, for example, we have a particular human behavior that we're trying to understand. Is it that there are any cases out there where one single level of explanation is enough and is the best one to use? Or is that not even a good or interesting question to ask, and we should just look across as many levels as possible?
I'm more for, let many flowers bloom, but some people do have a lot of, say, confidence that there is one right level of explanation in the cognitive sciences. I think that asking a question about best, typically, regardless of what the question is often ambiguous. So one can ask best in relation to what exactly? And then if you fill in the what with, for instance, certain aims of researchers, also their background knowledge about a certain system or a certain phenomenon, and also the technologies they have available, for studying that kind of problem, that kind of question, then I think it becomes increasingly obvious that there is no single best level for explaining phenomenon. Think about the example I gave you a moment ago about social norms. Now, we know more and more about the biological substrates of social norm compliance, partly because we have even more sophisticated technologies for recording and manipulating neural activities in the brain, and that provided helpful evidence also for constraining and informing explanations at a more psychological or sociological level. Okay, so I think that at the end of the day, there is no best or single best level, absolute best level for explaining, psychological phenomena or phenomena more generally. But there is mutual constraining and, say, informing different perspectives with results from another. So in a slogan, I would say that different levels enjoy autonomy, but not independence, something like Sicily in Italy.
but I mean, but do you think that it is possible to unify different approaches to human psychology and behavior? Because I mean, some of them are more centered on the brain and go from molecules to cells to networks and stuff like that, and others are more focused on the mind, let's say, like psychology, and others on culture, like anthropology, sociology, and so on. But do you think it's possible to unify them all or not?
I think it is logically possible. I don't think it's desirable. Let me explain why. I think that there are currently 2 or 3 models for thinking about unification in the sciences, prominent models. One is associated with a kind of reductionism from the 60s I was mentioning, where unification concerns the logical derivability of certain theories from more fundamental theories. Okay, so these are a picture of reduction, which would contribute unification in the sciences. A second model, which is associated with the new mechanist in the philosophy of science, where the emphasis is on mechanism discovery as one of the prominent aims in the sciences. The picture there is more mechanistic integration. That is, we start off from phenomena that puzzle us. Okay, so puzzling phenomena, some problem, and then we work out, different parts in a mechanism and their activities that contribute to generate the phenomena. So this would be a sort of mechanistic integration that would promote unity in relation to specific kinds of phenomena. Okay, so you work out relevant parts and activities in a mechanism that produces a phenomenon. A third way, which I kind of prefer, looks at unity in terms of a patchwork, in terms of a patchwork of perspectives that maintain some pluralism. So you're not going to reduce everything. You're not going to focus on a single mechanism producing a phenomenon. You're looking at the same, say, system or phenomenon from very different angles. And this kind of, say, unity, as I said, respects pluralism. So not only that, pluralism understood not just as a matter of fact, how science is performed now involves, many different approaches, largely disunified, depending on where you look, but also as a normative constraint. That is, the claim is that a plurality of approaches is the way the best science is produced, in a way also for promoting intellectual humility, and also for as a stimulus to inquiry, to explore, alternatives that might yet to be conceived. And so that would be a third way of understanding the, say, unity in the sciences.
So talking now about another big debate in the cognitive sciences, what are nativists and empiricists, and what do they disagree about exactly?
These are very broad umbrella terms, nativism and empiricism, to pick out, say, views about 2 things. One, the origin of psychological traits. That is, where do those traits come from? Do they come from the genes, from society, from culture, from what? And the second question has to do with the overall shape of our cognitive architecture. That is our cognitive architecture relying on very specific mechanisms devoted to solving very specific tasks? For instance, a mechanism for recognizing faces, a mechanism for writing, a mechanism for language learning? Or is our cognitive architecture including, say, mechanisms for general intelligence, general learning of many different capacities. So using the very same mechanism for learning a language, for recognizing faces, and so forth. So the nativist would say that, traits, psychological traits, are mostly, because again, now it's not a black and white debate anymore, are mostly channeled biologically.
Right.
And the empiricist would say that there is a strong component of learning and experience in how these biological channels get modulated to produce psychological traits. And so there is this big debate, and now it's been refueled in various ways by recent approaches, computational approaches to mind and behavior. Deep neural networks have been offered also as, a way to support a broad empiricist view about, the human cognitive architecture. And other approaches have seen a more, rationalist or nativist flavor in them. For instance, Bayesian cognitive science might be one of those examples.
Okay, so tell us more about that example then. What is Bayesian cognitive science and how does it contribute to this debate?
So this is an approach, a research program in the cognitive sciences that relies on modeling tools from statistics. So the key insight is that mental capacities solve inductive problems and represent inductive problems in probabilistic terms. Okay, so just to give you an example of what this means. So suppose that, I show you faces and I ask you, hey, is this face with a nose sticking out or sticking in? Okay, and I illuminate the face from different angles. Typically, people would perceive, depending on the lighting from above, the face as concave as opposed to convex, again, depending on the lighting. Right. And this kind of example would demonstrate that our perceptual illusions, for instance, this would be called sometimes the face mask illusion, where you perceive a face with a nose sticking out, where instead it's sticking in. Okay, this kind of phenomenon would be explained by positing prior expectations in our perceptual system that the typical source of lighting comes from above, okay, and information from the environment. To give you another example, these days in the Netherlands, in the morning is fairly foggy. I cycle to go to the uni, and my visual perception of the bikes around me suggests that those bikes go more slowly than they actually do. Why do we have this motion illusion? Well, according to a Bayesian story, a Bayesian explanation, people, humans and also other animals, have a prior expectation that objects in their surrounding either do not move or move very slowly. Okay? Now, this prior expectation is modulated by sensory information as I'm cycling to the university. This sensory information is quite uncertain because it's corrupted by noise, it's corrupted by a foggy condition where the contrast is bad. And so I give more weight to my prior expectation in figuring out the velocity of the bikes around me. And again, this would be an example where you have a combination of prior information, and sensory evidence to try to explain many phenomena ranging from perception to social cognition.
So I would like to ask you now about some more general questions in the philosophy of science. We're focusing mostly in cognitive science, but is value-free science possible?
The short answer is no. And the longer answer is not only it's not possible, but also not desirable. It's not possible because, as the last few years during the pandemic might have shown, there is no view from nowhere in science. These science, society, and politics are really bound
Right.
up. And then you have humans, as in scientists, working in social institutions like universities or, companies, whatnot. And, as humans, they also have values, emotions, prejudices, attitudes, whatever. So as a matter of, biological fact or fact about how humans happen to be, I don't think that a value-free science, that is a science free from all social, religious, political, ethical values, is possible. Now, is it desirable? I don't think it is either. And again, the last few years with the pandemics is suggestive for why it's not possible. It's not desirable either. When it comes, for instance, to assessing, to what extent we need evidence, more evidence in support of, for instance, a lockdown policy, there is a trade-off between making a mistake by introducing the policy, which maybe doesn't work, and making a mistake by not introducing the policy, which maybe, if it were introduced, would have saved many lives. Now, to arbitrate between these two types of mistakes and, acquiring sufficient evidence, to weigh, which policy would be the best, requires, political, financial, and social considerations in the mix. So this would be an example for why value-free science, not only it's not possible psychologically and biologically, but also not desirable, because if you think also of, for instance, the role of ethical guidelines in many sciences, including, for instance, artificial intelligence, which is raising more and more ethical concerns, it's obvious that the question is which values matter, for what purposes, and when.
Right. And I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong or if you don't agree with what I'm about to say, but I think also that even to do science itself, to accept the scientific method or methods, because that's another very big debate I don't want to get into now, but to accept that a particular methodology, a particular epistemologic approach to the world and to knowing what's out there and how reality works and so on. I mean, we have to accept the assumptions made by science as true, right? Because I mean, there are values, epistemological values, and so on associated with those assumptions that we just have to accept. Because if people simply do not accept them, they don't even have to give any value at all to the knowledge produced by science. Right.
Yeah, I in broad agreement with that view, with a couple of qualifications.
Okay.
One qualification is, as I mentioned, it's trivial that scientists are humans. In my experience during the pandemic, when I was exposed to scientists on public television in Italy or elsewhere, the public perception was going in two directions. Either, the scientist is a guru, an oracle, without any uncertainty. Okay, so, no uncertainties, oracle. Or the scientist is just a politician in disguise. That is, this person, is just playing the game of the, powerful politicians, and so not trustworthy at all. So these are two extremes that I think, sometimes cause a lot of confusion in public understanding of science.
Right.
That's one first qualification. The second qualification comes with disagreement. Disagreements among scientists can be extremely healthy, and it's actually the propellant of inquiry, often case. When it comes to the public perception of scientists, noticing disagreement can undermine the trust of the public towards science as an institution, which again happened during the pandemic, where certain policymakers and scientists were pushing for certain policies in a certain country, and others were pushing for a different policy in different countries. And then, the public, for instance, me, would ask, hey, but why is this the case? After all, they're all scientists. Why are they in disagreement here? And this can also be, dangerous because some disagreement is genuine and fruitful, as I mentioned. Some disagreement is bullshit, if you ask me. That is, some disagreement just depends on contrarian views that are not pushed by genuine experts. And so the challenge there for the public is to recognize, genuine experts. So this would be a sort of expert novice problem, and trust them. So trust, again, is one of the buzzwords which is key to relationship between novices and experts in any domain, and not just science.
So, but that's about mostly the production of scientific knowledge and how it's done and the assumptions scientists start from. But another question is, what about the appraisal of scientific hypotheses? That's also influenced by several political, moral, social values, right?
So in my work, I focused on the public understanding of science. The example I gave a moment ago, where you have to manage type 1 and type 2 errors, for instance, whether to introduce a lockdown policy or not, has more to do with scientists and policymakers, where to have to value financial, social considerations, health considerations when it comes to assessing, appraising the evidence. Okay. Now, in my own research with Joel Imbar, Leandra Bucher, Alex Kraus, and more recently with Giovanni Cassani, we looked at how the public understands scientific hypotheses and scientific language. More specifically, with Joel Imbar and Leandra Bucher, we looked at how participants, common people from the Netherlands and from the United States, would evaluate a mock report, so a mock abstract, let's say, providing evidence in support of different hypotheses. These hypotheses had the same very low prior credibility. One hypothesis we used was that eating pizza regularly every day increasing the chances of developing flu. Okay, that was one of the hypotheses. And then we compared similarly incredible hypotheses that differed in terms of moral offense they would provoke to participants. For instance, compare the eating pizza hypothesis and flu with the hypothesis that eating pizza regularly every day increasing the chances of becoming a bisexual person. Okay. The second hypothesis might be more emotionally charged, and some people, find it offensive. And what we found in our study is that along various dimensions about the quality of the reports supporting the hypothesis, in terms of willingness to fund that kind of research, in terms of the convincingness of that research, moral offense was negatively correlated with willingness to give money, to what extent the research was found convincing, plausibility. So there is a sort of negative association between endorsement of science and moral offense, even controlling for the prior credibility of a certain scientific hypothesis. More recently, with Giovanni Cassani, we looked at a different dimension of public understanding of science, which is that some of the concepts in science are thick concepts. What does it mean? It means that they're both evaluative and descriptive. If I give you examples like poverty, okay, poverty not only describes, a certain state of individuals or groups, but also evaluates the state as negative, as undesirable. And what we want to understand is how this thickness in some concepts, especially in the social sciences and health sciences, might influence people's understanding of, scientific research, hypotheses, and their objectivity. Right now, we are, running a series of tests, sort of, experimental philosophy-like, to see whether people would find the evaluative aspect of certain terms in science as eliminable. Again, to give you an example, if I say something like, Matteo is racist, but by that I don't mean anything negative about Matteo, am I contradicting myself? If you think not, then it means that racist might have a detachable evaluative component that is not so stable. Okay, and so we're looking at how this evaluative component is stable and how it might be predictive of people's attitudes towards certain scientific projects.
Right. So probably I will have to ask you to come back on the show when you have the results of those.
Anytime. As you might have noticed, a very broad interest. So.
Yeah. So, okay. So just one last question then. And because you, of course, as we've been talking about during the interview, you do work in different areas of philosophy and science. How do you look at the relationship between neuroscience, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and moral psychology? This is again a sort of similar question to the levels of explanation question, I guess, but now between different areas of philosophy and science.
Yeah, and this is also maybe a bit more personal, I suppose. So I care especially about these fields because at the end of the day, I want to understand how we should think about value, its place in nature, to better learn how to live. That's very much philosophical. That is, getting a better understanding of what's valuable, what ways in people's lives, or also non-people's life, like, non-human animals or plants or fungi, to better learn. And again, there is a sort of inquiry or intellectual unity dimension here, how to live. And this is the more moral psychology or ethical kind of pursuit. And, given my trajectory, my personal experiences, I got more and more passionate about these fields in philosophy and also outside philosophy, exactly to make progress on the question, how to live, what to value. Why do I find these fields especially insightful when it comes to that question? Again, it has to do with personal idiosyncrasies and personal development. I can see other people, taking the same question from a very different trajectory.
Right. So, Dr. Colombo, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
I have sort of WordPress, very simple website. I don't recall the name of the website, but it's something like mteocolombo.wordpress.com. If you type my name on Google or any other search engines and you add philosophy, Tilburg, probably my stuff will appear. And more generally, if you want to get in touch, feel free to get in touch, writing me an email.
Okay, great. So thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And as I said a few minutes ago, I hope to have you back on somewhere in the future.
Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks everybody for listening and for your attention. Cheers.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger, Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Aslan Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deja Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sunny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.